we are what now 1 week out from the election, and this primary is still something that's relatively undecided. There's not, like in a lot of other races, a clear front runner where things are basically wrapped up and a bunch of people trailing in the dust. This is really a race where a lot can happen in the upcoming days. I suppose I could start, let's see, clockwise here from top center with Tudor Dixon, who, polling shows that this is still a relatively undecided race, but she is considered to be sort of someone who has some of the most potential to come away with a victory here. She's from Norton Shores and was most recently a news personality on the conservative news network Real America's Voice. And she's worked for her father's steel company and has sort of been slowly becoming more and more involved in conservative circles over the past 4 or 5 years. As a candidate, she's leaned in hard on sort of the culture wars and talked about education and school choice quite a bit. And so this and sort of her polish as a candidate has enabled her to win over Michigan's sort of conservative donor class. And so she's racked up a slew of endorsements from senior Republican elected officials. And then, of course, the competition in this race, who is running relatively outside tracks, more populist and grassroots-oriented campaigns, have used this as a line of attack against her. But as a result, she's been able to bring significant financial resources to bear and spend quite a bit of money. But that still pales in comparison to our next candidate, who's Kevin Rinke. He is a businessman from Bloomfield Hills. He grew up in and then owned and expanded a chain of auto dealerships throughout the Metro Detroit. And he has considerable wealth that he's brought to bear in the race. He's invested $10 million of his own money in this election. And he's running sort of as a conservative outsider, a businessman who's not like beholden to anybody, considering his self-financing. If this sounds a little bit like perhaps, Michigan's last Republican governor, Rick Snyder, I'd say that they're pretty different when it comes to policy. His sort of most prominent policy proposal that has earned the most attention is that he says he wants to immediately eliminate Michigan's 4.25% income tax. This is a major chunk of the budget, and his opponents are attacking him, saying, I don't know how this is possible. But he is sort of, I would say, the most fiscally conservative, but has stanced himself a little bit away on some of these social conservative issues that really his opponents have pushed hard to the right on. I'd say someone who's taken more of a populist tack, though, is Garrett Soldano. He's a chiropractor from Mattawan who sort of has his origins in a solidly grassroots framing. He started the Facebook group of Michiganders against excessive quarantine, which grew to hundreds of thousands of members in a little over a month. And then he was sort of a leader of some of these protests and the organizations that followed in its wake. And so he's sort of had to carry that momentum and this devoted core of followers forward. So he's not raising and doesn't have this millions of dollars to bear. He's raised about $2. But running the populist lane, he's really sort of dependent on these volunteers to really sort of go to bat for him, knock doors and answer phones in the hopes that he can, have this swelling of grassroots support that will carry him to victory, even though he may not be, constantly on the television as some of his opponents are. I think another candidate in a similar lane here, and the most recognizable in the race, according to recent polling, is Ryan Kelley. He also had his roots in the resistance to Governor Gretchen Whitmer's public health emergency orders for the COVID-19 pandemic, but he sort of took a more fringe tack. He helped organize a group called the American Patriot Council, which was, it seems like, had some attention from authorities, and participated in, some of the more, I guess you could say, unsavory events, including the attack on the U.S. Capitol, January 6, 2021. He sort of exploded to prominence in this race when on June 9th, he was arrested for his involvement in that by the FBI at his home. And, this sort of immediately helped him surge to national prominence. He fundraised a pretty decent amount of money off of this. And as a result, was sort of hoped that this could, help him ride to the front of the pack in this gubernatorial election. But the money, at least, hasn't necessarily followed him with this fame. The fifth candidate now is Ralph Rebandt. He's a pastor from Farmington Hills, and he's sort of like the workman in this election. He's worked skilled trades. and on factory lines and as a janitor. And then it led the Oakland Hills Community Church, sort of an offshoot of the evangelical movement, for 35 years. And he's certainly the most socially conservative candidate in this race. He believes in abortion abortion should be prohibited without any exceptions, even to save the life of the mother, and has really focused on sort of cultural and social issues as the center of his campaign, while sort of glossing over the more nuts and bolts financial aspects to becoming governor.
Former President Donald Trump, his voice has been noticeably absent from this gubernatorial primary. And I believe it was, correct me if I'm wrong, Garrett Soldano who explicitly even made a plea, Mr. President, please don't actually weigh in yet, don't give your endorsement yet. Is there a reason why Trump is yet to endorse? And I guess what's sort of the logic behind his reasoning?
Right. So what I've heard from multiple sources is that, he would like to endorse, but that there's sort of, he has met, in his resort in Mar-a-Lago has different aides coming to him and sort of pulling him in different directions. And that there's not really a clear direction which everyone thinks would be most efficient for him to move in. And that's because these candidates sort of occupy the lanes, at least the three that are sort of most in line for his endorsement, which are said to be Tudor Dixon, Kevin Rinke, and Garrett Soldano. They occupy really the distinct lanes that were the source of tension within his White House. Garrett Soldano is very much sort of the populist, people's candidate for those that support him, whereas Tudor Dixon is sort of, enmeshed in the traditional power structure and power brokers of Republican politics. And Kevin Rinke is sort of a wealthy guy from the outside that probably can speak to Trump's own predilections of like what he likes in a candidate, which is himself. And so as a result, people are moving in different directions. And like any good rom-com, we are just sort of sitting here with bated breath wondering, will he or won't he?
Contesting election results was a major focus of the 2020 election. How likely do you think we are to see that happen again?
It's hard to say. A lot of these candidates are really on the Republican side, frankly. They've built their campaigns around doubting the legitimacy of the 2020 election. The 2020 election was secure. There was no widespread voter fraud, just to get that out there. But candidates continue to say that there was a lot of voter fraud. There wasn't. It'll be interesting to see, especially I think of the governor primary, where you'll have one winner and four losers, and will the losers say, well, there was fraud, I lost because of fraud? Ryan Kelley comes to mind, the guy on the top left, just because he's really talked about voter fraud a lot, even though they all have kind of touched on it. Will the four candidates challenge, the four losers can challenge and say, I didn't lose because I legitimately lost. I lost because of voter fraud. And then also, if the winner is a candidate who has had a history of doubting the legitimacy of the 2020 election, when they win, will they say, oh yeah, that was a safe election, there was no fraud? So it's going to be something that we watch on primary night and then through the end of the year, especially as President Donald Trump is still a big player in American politics. These claims of a stolen election and people harping on election fraud, this is just going to continue.